In the still air of a rural morning, a lonely widow walks toward the back of her property, carrying a bucket of water. As she approaches an abandoned cistern, she sees a dark body floating among debris, her German shepherd, with its paws tied together. Without a sound, the woman drops the bucket and steps closer, staring at the murky surface. On the fence beside her, a diapered baby, the neighbor's child, grabs the bars and watches in silence. The widow quickly turns and walks back into her house, leaving the body adrift. Just as the baby crawls toward the edge, the water inside the cistern begins to move. But what happens next, no one will ever know. The morning sun cast its golden rays across the sprawling farmlands of Millbrook County, Nebraska, where rolling hills stretched endlessly toward the horizon like waves of emerald green. The air carried the sweet scent of wildflowers and freshly cut grass, while a gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees that lined the gravel roads connecting the scattered homesteads. This was the kind of place where neighbors still waved from their front porches, where children played freely in vast open spaces, and where the most exciting event of the week was usually the Saturday farmers market in town. Margaret Thompson had called this peaceful corner of the world home for over 30 years. At 62, she was a woman whose silver hair caught the morning light like spun silk, and whose kind blue eyes held both wisdom and a hint of loneliness that had settled there since her husband Robert's unexpected departure from her life 3 years prior. Her 2-story farmhouse, painted a cheerful yellow with white trim, sat on 12 acres of land that had been in Robert's family for generations. The wraparound porch was adorned with hanging baskets of petunias and geraniums that Margaret tended with loving care, finding solace in the simple act of nurturing something beautiful. But it was her constant companion, Duke, who truly kept the loneliness at bay. The magnificent German shepherd had arrived in her life as a puppy just months before Robert's sudden absence, and had grown into a loyal, intelligent dog whose amber eyes seemed to understand her every emotion. Duke was more than a pet. He was family, confidant, and guardian, all rolled into one beautiful creature whose black and tan coat gleamed in the sunlight as he bounded across the property with boundless energy. This particular Tuesday morning began like countless others. Margaret stepped onto her back porch at precisely 7 o'clock, coffee mug in hand, ready to call Duke for his morning meal. The routine was sacred to both of them. Duke would come running from wherever his adventures had taken him during the night, tail wagging furiously, and would sit patiently by his food bowl while Margaret prepared his breakfast, speaking to him in the gentle tones she might use with a beloved child. But today, something was different. Margaret called out across the yard, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air, but Duke didn't come bounding toward her with his usual enthusiasm. She called again, louder this time, scanning the familiar landscape of her property. The old red barn stood silent, its doors slightly ajar as always. The chicken coop buzzed with the soft murmur of hens beginning their daily routine. Yet there was no sign of the German shepherd who usually appeared at the first sound of her voice. A flutter of concern began in Margaret's chest as she set down her coffee mug and stepped off the porch. She walked toward the barn, calling Duke's name repeatedly, her voice growing more urgent with each unanswered call. Perhaps he had gotten himself stuck somewhere, or maybe he was injured and couldn't respond. The possibilities raced through her mind as she quickened her pace, checking behind the barn, around the old grain silo, and near the edge of the property where Duke sometimes chased rabbits. It was then that Margaret remembered the old cistern. Located near the far corner of her property, close to where the land bordered her neighbor's farm, the stone-lined cistern had been abandoned for decades. Robert had always meant to have it properly sealed, but like so many projects around the farm, it had remained on his ever-growing list of things to do someday. The heavy wooden cover that topped the circular opening had warped over the years, leaving gaps that concerned Margaret, though she rarely ventured to that remote part of the property. As she approached the cistern, her heart began to pound with a dread she couldn't quite explain. The morning that had started so peacefully now felt heavy with an ominous energy that made her skin prickle with anxiety. She could hear her own breathing, quick and shallow, as she drew closer to the weathered wooden cover that sat askew over the opening. What Margaret saw when she peered into the cistern's depths would be seared into her memory forever. There, floating in the murky water below, was Duke. Her beloved companion lay motionless, his beautiful coat dark with water, his legs bound together with what appeared to be rope. The sight hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and bringing her to her knees beside the cistern's edge. The scream that tore from Margaret's throat was a sound of pure anguish that echoed across the farmland, causing birds to take flight from nearby trees and sending a chill through anyone within hearing distance. It was the cry of a heartbreaking, of a soul confronting cruelty beyond comprehension. How could anyone do such a thing to an innocent animal? How could someone in their peaceful community harbor such darkness? Through her tears, Margaret could see that Duke was still breathing, though barely. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular movements that told her he was fighting for his life. Without hesitation, she ran back toward her house, her legs shaking with adrenaline and terror, her mind racing to figure out how she could possibly rescue the 70-pound dog from the 15-foot-deep cistern. As she burst through her kitchen door to call for help, Margaret's thoughts turned immediately to her neighbors. The Hendersons lived closest, just a quarter-mile down the county road. Tom Henderson had always been kind to her, especially after Robert's departure, and he had the equipment needed for such a rescue. But even as she reached for the phone, a terrible question gnawed at her mind. Who in their close-knit community could have done this? The sound of her own sobs filled the kitchen as she dialed Tom's number with trembling fingers. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of a baby crying, a reminder that life continued its rhythm even as her world crumbled around her. That cry belonged to little Emma, the 6-month-old daughter of Sarah Mitchell, who lived in the small cottage on the adjacent property. Sarah was a young single mother who had moved to Millbrook County just 8 months ago, seeking the kind of peaceful life that Margaret had always treasured. As Margaret waited for Tom to answer his phone, she found herself staring out the kitchen window toward the cistern, her mind struggling to process what had happened. Duke had always been friendly with everyone in the community. He had never shown aggression toward anyone, never caused trouble for the neighbors. The idea that someone would deliberately hurt him seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. The questions multiplied in her mind with each passing second. When had this happened? How long had Duke been in the water? Who could have overpowered such a strong, alert dog? And most disturbing of all, what kind of person lived among them who was capable of such cruelty? The peaceful morning that had begun with such promise now felt like the beginning of something dark and uncertain, something that would change their quiet community forever. Tom Henderson's gruff voice answered on the third ring, heavy with the exhaustion of a man who had been up since 4:30 tending to his dairy cattle. When Margaret's sobbing words tumbled through the phone, explaining the horrific discovery at the cistern, his tone immediately shifted to one of urgent concern. Within minutes, she could hear the rumble of his pickup truck racing down the county road, followed by the distinctive whine of his tractor as he gathered the equipment needed for the rescue. Margaret stood beside the cistern, her hands pressed to her mouth to stifle the sobs that threatened to overwhelm her. Duke's breathing had become even more labored, and she could see his beautiful amber eyes struggling to focus as he fought against the rope bindings that held his legs. The sight of her loyal companion suffering filled her with a rage she had never experienced before, a burning anger directed at the unknown person who had committed this act of cruelty. Tom Henderson arrived with his son, Billy, a strapping 25-year-old who worked alongside his father on the dairy farm. Both men moved with the efficiency of people accustomed to handling emergencies, though Margaret could see the shock and anger in their faces as they peered down into the cistern. Tom immediately began rigging a pulley system using rope and a harness he had brought from his barn, while Billy prepared to rappel down into the water. As the rescue operation began, other neighbors started arriving, drawn by Margaret's earlier scream and the unusual activity at the Thompson farm. Sarah Mitchell appeared first, carrying her 6-month-old daughter Emma in her arms. Sarah was a petite woman with auburn hair and green eyes that held a wariness born of past hardships. She had moved to Millbrook County seeking a fresh start after a difficult relationship had ended badly, and she worked as a freelance graphic designer from her small cottage while caring for Emma. Behind Sarah came elderly Mrs. Patterson from the house across the county road, followed by the Kowalski family from the farm to the east. Word spread quickly in a community where everyone knew everyone else, and soon nearly a dozen neighbors had gathered around the cistern, their faces reflecting a mixture of concern, shock, and growing anger. It was Dr. James Morrison, the local veterinarian who lived on the outskirts of town, who arrived just as Billy was lowering himself into the cistern. Dr. Morrison was a tall, lean man in his 50s, with prematurely grey hair and gentle hands that had saved countless animals throughout his 30-year career. He had been a close friend of Robert Thompson and had continued to care for Duke without charge since Margaret's financial situation had become strained. The rescue itself was harrowing. Billy had to carefully cut the ropes binding Duke's legs, while keeping the semi-conscious dog's head above water, then secure him in the harness Tom had fashioned. Duke, despite his weakened condition, seemed to understand that help had arrived and remained calm as he was slowly lifted from the cistern. When he finally emerged, water streaming from his magnificent coat, a cheer went up from the assembled neighbors. Dr. Morrison immediately took charge of Duke's care, examining him with practiced hands while explaining to Margaret that the dog was suffering from hypothermia and near drowning, but appeared to have no serious injuries apart from rope burns on his legs. The fact that Duke was alive at all was nothing short of miraculous, considering how long he might have been in the water. As Dr. Morrison worked to stabilize Duke, wrapping him in blankets and administering medication, the neighbors began discussing the disturbing implications of what had happened. Someone in their peaceful community had deliberately tried to harm an innocent animal, and the thought sent shockwaves through the group. Tom Henderson's face was grim as he examined the ropes that had bound Duke's legs, noting that they were of good quality and had been tied with the kind of knots used by someone with experience. It was then that young Emma, cradled in her mother's arms, began to fuss and reach toward the blanket-wrapped form of Duke. Sarah tried to pull her daughter back, concerned about the dog's condition, but Emma's tiny hands stretched persistently toward the animal. Dr. Morrison, noticing the baby's interest, surprised everyone by suggesting that perhaps the child's presence might actually be beneficial. What happened next defied all logical explanation and would become the source of endless speculation in the days to come. As Sarah cautiously moved closer with Emma, the baby's small hand managed to touch Duke's wet nose. At that moment, the German shepherd, who had been lying motionless and barely responsive, lifted his head with tremendous effort and gently licked the baby's fingers, The effect was immediate and startling. Duke's breathing seemed to strengthen, his eyes became more alert, and a visible shudder passed through his body as if he was drawing energy from the innocent touch of the child. Emma laughed with delight, a pure, joyful sound that rang out across the assembled crowd like a bell. Several of the neighbors stepped back in amazement, while others whispered among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Dr. Morrison, a man of science who had seen many inexplicable things in his years of veterinary practice, simply nodded thoughtfully and continued his examination of Duke. But Margaret noticed the way his eyebrows raised and how he glanced between the baby and the dog with newfound interest. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed both fascinated and slightly troubled by her daughter's unusual connection to the injured animal. As the immediate crisis passed and Duke was carefully transported to Dr. Morrison's clinic for further treatment, the neighbors began to disperse, but not before the whispered conversations had begun. Mrs. Patterson, who at 87 was the unofficial keeper of local gossip and history, pulled several people aside to share her observations about the strange interaction between Emma and Duke. The Kowalski family exchanged meaningful glances as they discussed the incident in hushed Polish. Tom Henderson lingered longer than the others, helping Margaret secure the cistern with heavy boards and a tarp to prevent any future accidents. As they worked together, he shared his concerns about the deliberate nature of the attack on Duke. The ropes had been professionally tied, and whoever had done this had taken considerable risk to carry out their plan. It wasn't a random act of cruelty, but something more calculated and personal. As the afternoon wore on and the neighbors finally departed, Margaret found herself alone with her thoughts and 1,000 unanswered questions. She stood on her back porch, looking out over the property that had always represented safety and peace, now feeling vulnerable and violated. Someone had come onto her land with malicious intent, and the thought made her skin crawl with anxiety. But beyond her fear and anger, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about what had happened when Emma touched Duke. There had been something almost magical in that moment, something that defied rational explanation. The baby's laugh had been so pure, so joyful, and Duke's response had been immediate and profound. She found herself wondering if there was more to the connection between the child and her dog than anyone could understand. As evening approached and the golden light of sunset painted the farmland in warm hues, Margaret made a decision that would change the course of everything that followed. She walked to her kitchen phone and dialed Sarah Mitchell's number, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation as she prepared to ask questions that might reveal secrets she wasn't prepared to handle. Sarah Mitchell's voice carried a note of uncertainty when she answered Margaret's call that evening. The two women had maintained a polite but distant relationship since Sarah's arrival in Millbrook County, exchanging pleasantries when their paths crossed, but never developing the kind of close friendship that often flourished between neighbors in rural communities. Margaret had always sensed that Sarah was guarding something, keeping her past carefully hidden behind a wall of reserved politeness. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the phone, unsure how to begin the conversation that had been weighing on her mind since the afternoon's extraordinary events. She started hesitantly, thanking Sarah for coming to help during the crisis and expressing her gratitude for Dr. Morrison's care of Duke. But as the conversation progressed, Margaret found herself drawn into deeper waters, asking questions about Emma's unusual reaction to the injured dog. Sarah's response was measured and careful, as if she were weighing each word before speaking. She acknowledged that Emma had always shown an unusual affinity for animals, seeming to calm distressed pets and wildlife in ways that surprised even her pediatrician. But when Margaret pressed gently for more details, Sarah's voice grew tighter, more guarded. She mentioned that Emma's father had never been part of their lives and changed the subject quickly when Margaret asked about their life before moving to Nebraska. As they talked, Margaret became increasingly aware that Sarah knew more than she was revealing. There were long pauses in the conversation, moments when Sarah seemed to be considering whether to share something important. When Margaret mentioned how Duke had seemed to draw strength from Emma's touch, Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the phone line. After another lengthy silence, Sarah finally admitted that similar incidents had occurred before, but she had never found anyone who would believe her stories. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at Margaret's front door. Through the window, she could see Tom Henderson standing on her porch, his weathered face etched with concern. Margaret excused herself from the phone call, promising Sarah they would continue their discussion soon, and went to answer the door. Tom's expression was grave as he stepped into Margaret's living room, removing his worn baseball cap and running his fingers through his graying hair. He had spent the afternoon asking questions around the community, trying to piece together any information that might lead to Duke's attacker. What he had discovered was troubling and had prompted his evening visit to Margaret's house. According to Tom's investigation, several neighbors had noticed unusual activity around Margaret's property over the past few weeks. Mrs. Patterson had observed a figure moving near the cistern on moonlit nights, though she had dismissed it as her aging eyes playing tricks on her. The Kowalski family's teenage son had mentioned seeing someone with a flashlight in Margaret's back pasture, but had assumed it was Margaret herself checking on something. More disturbing still was Tom's conversation with Eddie Martinez, who delivered mail to the rural routes surrounding Millbrook County. Eddie had noticed that Margaret's mailbox had been tampered with on several occasions, and he had found muddy footprints near the post that didn't match Margaret's small shoe size. When Tom pressed him for details, Eddie revealed that he had been finding strange, anonymous letters in several mailboxes throughout the area, letters that seemed designed to create suspicion and discord among the neighbors. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as Tom described the letters. She had received one herself just 2 days earlier, a typed note with no signature that made vague accusations about a neighbor's suspicious behavior. The letter had mentioned Henry Blackwood, the reclusive man who lived alone on the far edge of the community, suggesting that his solitary lifestyle and odd habits made him dangerous to the neighborhood's children and pets. Henry Blackwood had been a source of local speculation for the 3 years he had lived in Millbrook County. A man in his late 40s with prematurely white hair and intense gray eyes, Henry kept to himself almost entirely, venturing into town only for essential supplies and rarely speaking to anyone beyond the necessary pleasantries. His property was overgrown and unkempt, and his house, a once grand Victorian that had been in disrepair when he purchased it, remained in a state of perpetual renovation that never seemed to progress. The anonymous letter had painted Henry as a potential threat, citing his strange nocturnal walks, his collection of antique books on unusual subjects, and his apparent hostility toward neighboring pets that wandered onto his property. Margaret had initially dismissed the letter as malicious gossip, but now, in light of the attack on Duke, she found herself wondering if there might be truth to the accusations. Tom's investigation had revealed that Henry had been the subject of several of the anonymous letters circulating through the community. Some letters suggested he was conducting strange experiments in his basement, while others hinted at a dark past that had driven him to seek isolation in rural Nebraska. The letters were always vague enough to avoid specific accusations, but pointed enough to plant seeds of suspicion and fear. As Margaret and Tom discussed these revelations, Margaret remembered something that had been bothering her since Duke's rescue. When Dr. Morrison had been examining the ropes used to bind Duke's legs, he had mentioned that the knots were tied with professional skill, suggesting someone with specialized knowledge. Henry Blackwood, she recalled, had mentioned during one of their few conversations that he had served in the military before moving to Nebraska. The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of Margaret's phone. Sarah Mitchell's voice was urgent when Margaret answered, explaining that Emma had been crying inconsolably since their earlier conversation and seemed to be calling out for something or someone. Sarah had tried everything to comfort her daughter, but nothing worked until she had brought Emma to the window facing Margaret's property. Only then had the baby calmed down, reaching her tiny hands toward the direction of Margaret's house as if searching for something. This new development sent a shiver of unease through Margaret. The connection between Emma and Duke was becoming more mysterious and pronounced, and she found herself wondering what it might mean. As she shared this information with Tom, his expression grew increasingly troubled. He had heard similar stories before, though not in Millbrook County, and they never ended well for the families involved. Tom suggested that Margaret might want to consider staying with relatives for a few days until the situation was resolved, but Margaret firmly declined. This was her home, the place where she had built a life with Robert, and she wouldn't be driven away by fear and speculation. However, she did agree to Tom's suggestion that they organize a community meeting to discuss the recent events and address the growing tension created by the anonymous letters. As Tom prepared to leave, he paused at the door and turned back to Margaret with a serious expression. He had one more piece of information to share, something he had hesitated to mention earlier. During his conversations with neighbors, he had learned that Robert Thompson's sudden departure 3 years earlier had been surrounded by circumstances that were never fully explained. Several people had noticed that Robert had seemed increasingly agitated in the weeks before he left, often seen walking the property at night with a flashlight, particularly near the area where the old cistern was located. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet as Tom's words sank in. Robert had never mentioned any problems or concerns about the property, and his departure had been explained as a sudden opportunity for work in another state. But now Tom was suggesting that there might have been more to Robert's leaving than she had ever known, and that it might somehow be connected to the current crisis. After Tom left, Margaret found herself alone with thoughts that swirled like a storm in her mind. The peaceful life she had known was crumbling around her, replaced by a web of secrets, suspicions, and inexplicable connections that she couldn't begin to understand. As she locked her doors and checked her windows for the first time in years, she couldn't shake the feeling that the attack on Duke was just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than she could have imagined. Margaret spent a sleepless night pacing through her farmhouse, her mind racing with questions about Robert's final weeks in Millbrook County. She had always accepted his explanation that a job opportunity in Colorado had required his immediate departure. But now, Tom's revelation cast doubt on everything she thought she knew about her husband's reasons for leaving. As dawn broke over the Nebraska farmland, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She would search through Robert's belongings, something she had been emotionally unable to do in the 3 years since his departure. The attic had always been Robert's domain, a cluttered space where he stored his tools, hunting equipment, and boxes of documents related to the farm's operation. Margaret climbed the narrow stairs with determination, though her heart pounded with anxiety about what she might discover. Dust motes danced in the early morning light, filtering through the small window as she began her methodical search through boxes that had remained untouched since Robert left. It was in the third box that Margaret found Robert's journal, a leather-bound notebook she had never seen before. Her hands trembled as she opened it, immediately recognizing her husband's careful handwriting on pages that chronicled the final months of his time in Millbrook County. What she read there would shake her understanding of everything that had happened. Robert's entries revealed a growing obsession with strange occurrences on their property. He wrote about unusual sounds coming from the direction of the old cistern, particularly during full moons, and described finding evidence that someone had been digging near the abandoned well that sat on the far corner of their land. Most disturbing were his accounts of discovering small animals that had apparently been placed in ritualistic patterns around the property, though they were always unharmed and seemed to have been gently positioned rather than harmed. As Margaret read deeper into the journal, she learned that Robert had been conducting his own investigation into the property's history. He had discovered that their land had once been owned by a family named Whitmore, who had abandoned the farm abruptly in 1892 under mysterious circumstances. According to county records that Robert had researched, the Whitmore family had reported strange phenomena, including unexplained healing of sick animals and an unusual spring that seemed to have restorative properties. The journal entries became increasingly urgent as Robert described his growing conviction that someone was trying to access whatever source of power lay beneath their property. He had installed motion sensors near the cistern and the old well, and had documented numerous instances of nighttime trespassers who seemed to know exactly where to look for something specific. His final entries spoke of his fear that Margaret might be in danger if he revealed what he had learned, and his decision to leave in order to draw attention away from her. Margaret's hands shook as she read Robert's final entry, dated just 2 days before his departure. He wrote about confronting someone he had caught trespassing near the well, someone who had threatened Margaret's safety if Robert didn't leave Millbrook County immediately. Robert had decided that protecting Margaret required him to disappear from her life, even if it meant she would never understand his reasons for leaving. The implications of Robert's journal hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her husband hadn't abandoned her for a job opportunity. He had left to protect her from a threat he believed was real and immediate. Someone had been searching their property for years, looking for something that Robert believed was connected to the unusual healing properties that seemed to manifest around certain locations on their land. As Margaret sat in the dusty attic, processing these revelations, she heard the sound of a car pulling into her driveway. Through the small window, she could see Dr. Morrison's veterinary truck parked near her front porch. She quickly gathered Robert's journal and other relevant papers, then hurried downstairs to meet the veterinarian who had become such an important ally in the crisis surrounding Duke. Dr. Morrison's expression was both pleased and puzzled as he updated Margaret on Duke's condition. The German Shepherd had made a remarkable recovery overnight, far faster than should have been medically possible given his near-drowning experience. His vital signs were strong, his appetite had returned, and his energy levels were nearly normal. Most surprising of all, the rope burns on his legs had healed to an extent that suggested weeks rather than hours of recovery time. When Margaret shared Robert's journal with Dr. Morrison, the veterinarian's reaction was immediate and intense. He revealed that he had been aware of unusual healing properties associated with certain locations in Millbrook County, though he had never spoken about them publicly for fear of being dismissed as eccentric. Over his 30 years of practice, he had noticed that animals treated near the old Whitmore property consistently recovered faster than should have been possible, and he had long suspected that there was something unique about the land itself. Dr. Morrison's revelation led to an even more startling confession. He had known Robert Thompson well, and in the months before Robert's departure, the two men had discussed the strange phenomena occurring on the Thompson property. Robert had asked Dr. Morrison to keep watch over Margaret and Duke if anything happened to him, a request that the veterinarian had promised to honor without fully understanding its implications. As they talked, Margaret began to piece together a disturbing pattern. Someone had been systematically targeting properties in Millbrook County that showed signs of unusual healing or restorative properties. The anonymous letters circulating through the community were designed to create suspicion and discord, making it easier for the real perpetrator to operate without scrutiny. Henry Blackwood, she realized, might not be the villain at all, but rather another target of the same person who had threatened Robert. The sound of multiple vehicles arriving at Margaret's house interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see that the impromptu community meeting Tom Henderson had suggested was gathering momentum. Cars and trucks lined the county road as neighbors arrived to discuss the recent events and address the growing tension that had settled over their peaceful community. Sarah Mitchell was among the first to arrive, carrying Emma in her arms and looking more anxious than Margaret had ever seen her. As Sarah approached the house, Emma began reaching excitedly toward the direction where Duke was recovering, babbling in the wordless language of infancy, but with an urgency that seemed to communicate something important. Sarah's expression was troubled as she explained that Emma had been restless all night, seeming to sense something that the adults couldn't understand. Tom Henderson arrived with his son, Billy, followed quickly by Mrs. Patterson, the Kowalski family, and several other neighbors. But it was the unexpected arrival of Henry Blackwood that created a stir among the assembled group. Henry stepped out of his battered pickup truck with obvious reluctance, his gray eyes scanning the crowd with the wariness of someone who expected hostility. Margaret watched as whispered conversations began among the neighbors, many of them glancing suspiciously at Henry, while others seemed genuinely surprised by his presence. It was clear that the anonymous letters had done their work, creating an atmosphere of mistrust that made genuine communication difficult. But Margaret, armed with the knowledge from Robert's journal, began to see the situation differently. As the group gathered on Margaret's front porch, she made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of allowing the meeting to proceed with accusations and suspicions, she announced that she had important information to share that would change everyone's understanding of recent events. She invited Henry Blackwood to join the inner circle of the discussion, a gesture that raised eyebrows and prompted more whispered conversations among the neighbors. The tension in the air was palpable as Margaret prepared to reveal what she had learned from Robert's journal. She could see the doubt and fear in her neighbors' faces, the way they positioned themselves to keep Henry at a distance while staying close enough to hear what she had to say. Emma continued to reach toward the house where Duke was recovering, her small voice adding an eerie counterpoint to the adult conversations swirling around her. Margaret took a deep breath and began to speak, knowing that her words would either bring the community together in understanding or tear it apart with accusations and blame. The peaceful morning that had started with such promise was about to become the catalyst for revelations that would change Millbrook County forever. Margaret's voice carried clearly across the assembled neighbors as she began reading excerpts from Robert's journal, her words cutting through the morning air like a knife through the veil of suspicion that had settled over their community. The revelation that Robert had been investigating mysterious occurrences on their property for months before his departure sent shockwaves through the group. Mrs. Patterson gasped audibly when Margaret described the evidence of systematic trespassing, while Tom Henderson's face grew increasingly grim as the scope of the deception became clear. Henry Blackwood's reaction was the most telling of all. As Margaret read Robert's accounts of confronting an unknown trespasser near the old well, Henry's weathered features transformed from wariness to something approaching relief. When she finished reading the entry about Robert's decision to leave in order to protect her, Henry stepped forward with obvious emotion and spoke for the first time since arriving at the gathering. His voice was rough with years of self-imposed isolation, but his words carried the weight of truth as he revealed his own story. Henry explained that he had moved to Millbrook County specifically because he had been researching the unusual properties associated with the former Whitmore land. As a former military medic who had witnessed unexplainable healing during his service, he had become fascinated with locations that seemed to possess natural restorative abilities. The assembled neighbors listened in stunned silence as Henry described his discovery that their peaceful community sat atop what appeared to be a network of underground springs with remarkable healing properties. He had purchased his rundown Victorian house precisely because it sat on land that had once belonged to the extended Whitmore family, and his nocturnal walks were actually careful surveys designed to map the extent of the underground water system. Henry's revelation explained many of the suspicious behaviors that had been attributed to him in the anonymous letters. His collection of antique books dealt with historical accounts of natural healing sites, and his basement contained research materials and water samples, not dangerous experiments. His apparent hostility toward neighboring pets was actually protective behavior. He had been trying to prevent animals from accessing certain springs that he believed might be dangerous if consumed in large quantities. Dr. Morrison corroborated Henry's account with his own observations about accelerated healing in animals treated near specific locations in the area. He revealed that he had been quietly documenting these phenomena for years, building a case study that he hoped might eventually be accepted by veterinary journals. The connection between Emma's unusual affinity for animals and the healing properties of the land began to make a strange kind of sense. As the community absorbed these revelations, Sarah Mitchell stepped forward with visible reluctance. Her hands tightened protectively around Emma as she began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, as she shared the secret she had been guarding since arriving in Millbrook County. Emma's father, she revealed, had been a researcher studying similar phenomena in other parts of the country, and their relationship had ended when his obsession with finding locations of unusual healing power had become dangerous. Sarah's revelation sent another ripple of shock through the assembled neighbors. She explained that Emma's unusual reactions to animals and her apparent ability to sense healing energy were traits that her father had been studying in other children born near sites with similar properties. When Sarah had discovered that her former partner was conducting unauthorized experiments involving children, she had fled with Emma, eventually settling in Millbrook County because she believed it was far enough from his research network to be safe. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a disturbing picture. Someone with extensive knowledge of healing sites was systematically targeting communities like theirs, using intimidation and manipulation to gain access to the natural resources that lay beneath their land. The anonymous letters were a tool designed to create enough chaos and suspicion that legitimate residents would either leave or become too distracted to notice the real threat. Tom Henderson's construction experience proved valuable as he began connecting dots that others had missed. He pointed out that the professional quality of the ropes used to bind Duke, combined with the sophisticated nature of the psychological warfare being waged through the anonymous letters, suggested they were dealing with someone with both tactical training and significant resources. This wasn't a local problem, but part of a larger pattern that had likely affected other communities. Henry confirmed Tom's suspicions by revealing that his research had uncovered similar incidents in rural communities across the Midwest. Properties with unusual healing characteristics were being systematically investigated by individuals who seemed to have advanced knowledge of their locations. In each case, long-term residents reported mysterious trespassing, intimidation tactics, and ultimately forced sales of their land to shell companies that couldn't be traced to any legitimate business interests. The discussion was interrupted by Emma's suddenly urgent crying, a sound that immediately drew everyone's attention. The baby was reaching frantically toward Margaret's house, her small voice rising to a wail that seemed to communicate genuine distress. Sarah tried to calm her daughter, but Emma's agitation only increased, her tiny hands grasping at the air as if trying to reach something or someone inside the house. Dr. Morrison immediately recognized the significance of Emma's reaction. Duke, who had been resting quietly in Margaret's living room, was likely responding to the baby's distress in ways that the adults couldn't perceive. The connection between the child and the dog had transcended the physical trauma of Duke's near drowning, creating a bond that seemed to operate on levels beyond normal understanding. Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She invited the entire group into her house, suggesting that they needed to witness firsthand the interaction between Emma and Duke. Despite the unconventional nature of the request, the neighbors followed her inside, drawn by curiosity and growing understanding that they were dealing with phenomena beyond their previous experience. The scene that unfolded in Margaret's living room would remain etched in everyone's memory forever. Duke, who had been lying quietly on his blanket near the fireplace, immediately raised his head when Emma entered the room. The baby's crying stopped instantly, replaced by soft coos of contentment as she reached toward the German Shepherd. When Sarah cautiously allowed Emma to approach Duke, the dog gently nuzzled the child's hand, and a visible sense of peace settled over both animals and humans alike. It was Mrs. Patterson who first noticed the change in Duke's appearance. The rope burns on his legs, which had been angry red marks just hours earlier, had faded to barely visible pink lines. His coat, which had been dull and matted from his ordeal in the cistern, now gleamed with health and vitality. Most remarkably, his eyes held a clarity and alertness that seemed almost supernatural in their intensity. The assembled neighbors stood in awed silence as they witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural. A world, Emma babbled happily as she gently patted Duke's head, while the dog remained perfectly still, as if he understood the sacred nature of their connection. The healing that was taking place before their eyes was undeniable, but it raised questions that none of them were prepared to answer. Henry Blackwood broke the silence with the observation that sent chills through the group. If word of Emma's abilities ever reached the wrong people, the child would become a target for individuals who would stop at nothing to exploit her gift. The attack on Duke might have been a test, a way of determining whether the healing properties of the area extended to the people and animals who lived there. As the implications of this possibility settled over the group, Margaret realized that protecting Emma and preserving their community would require them to work together in ways they had never imagined. The anonymous letters and suspicions that had divided them were exactly what their unknown enemy had hoped to achieve. Only by standing united could they hope to defend against a threat that was far more sophisticated and dangerous than any of them had initially understood. The peaceful morning that had begun with such promise was now transformed into something else entirely. The beginning of a fight for their community's survival against forces that operated in shadows and sought to steal the very essence of what made their land special. The peaceful atmosphere in Margaret's living room was shattered by the distinctive sound of a vehicle pulling rapidly into the driveway, its engine running at a higher pitch than the familiar trucks and cars of the local neighbors. Through the front window, the assembled group could see a sleek black SUV with tinted windows, a vehicle that looked completely out of place among the rural driveways and farm equipment of Millbrook County. Sarah Mitchell's face went pale the moment she saw the vehicle, and her arms tightened protectively around Emma. Her whispered, "Oh no, he found us," sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. Dr. Morrison immediately moved closer to Duke, whose ears had pricked up and whose body had tensed, as if sensing immediate danger. From the SUV emerged a man in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit that seemed absurdly formal for rural Nebraska. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his movements carried the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. But it was his eyes that made everyone in Margaret's living room instinctively step back from the windows. They held a calculating coldness that spoke of intelligence without compassion, ambition without conscience. Sarah's voice was barely audible as she identified the man as Dr. Marcus Winters, Emma's father and the researcher she had fled from 8 months earlier. She explained to the horrified neighbors that Marcus worked for a private research consortium that specialized in locating and exploiting natural phenomena that could be commercialized. His particular area of expertise was identifying children born near sites with unusual properties, children who seemed to inherit enhanced sensitivities that could be studied and potentially replicated. Henry Blackwood's military training became apparent as he immediately took charge of the situation, positioning himself near the front door while instructing the others to remain calm and avoid any actions that might escalate the confrontation. He revealed that his research into healing sites had uncovered disturbing reports about Dr. Winters and his consortium, including allegations of unauthorized experiments and the systematic displacement of families from valuable properties. The knock on Margaret's front door came with the measured confidence of someone who expected to be welcomed inside. When Margaret opened the door with obvious reluctance, Dr. Winters smiled with the practiced charm of a man accustomed to manipulating people to achieve his goals. His voice was smooth and professional as he introduced himself and expressed concern about Emma's well-being, claiming that Sarah had taken their daughter without permission and that he had been searching for them for months. Margaret's response surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of the uncertainty that might have been expected, she stood firm in her doorway and politely but firmly informed Dr. Winters that Sarah and Emma were guests in her home and were under no obligation to speak with him. Her voice carried the authority of someone defending her own territory, and she made it clear that he was not welcome on her property. Dr. Winters' facade of polite concern began to crack as he realized that he was not dealing with the isolated and frightened woman he had expected to find. His eyes swept the assembled neighbors visible behind Margaret, quickly assessing the situation and recognizing that his usual tactics of intimidation and manipulation would not work in this context. When he caught sight of Henry Blackwood standing protectively near Sarah and Emma, his expression hardened noticeably. The confrontation escalated when Dr. Winters attempted to push past Margaret into her living room, claiming legal rights to see his daughter. Tom Henderson immediately stepped forward, his construction worker's frame creating an imposing barrier while Billy moved to block the back entrance. The other neighbors formed a protective circle around Sarah and Emma, their earlier suspicions and divisions forgotten in the face of a real threat to one of their own. It was then that Dr. Winters revealed his true intentions. Dropping all pretense of paternal concern, he began speaking about the unique properties of the Millbrook County area, demonstrating knowledge that could only have come from extensive surveillance and research. He knew about the underground springs, the healing properties of the land, and most disturbing of all, he knew about the specific abilities that Emma had inherited from being born near such a site. Dr. Winters' revelations painted a horrifying picture of exploitation and greed. His consortium had been systematically targeting rural communities with unusual properties, using a combination of legal manipulation, economic pressure, and psychological warfare to force residents to sell their land far below its true value. The anonymous letters that had been circulating through Millbrook County were part of a sophisticated campaign designed to create enough chaos and mistrust that the community would become vulnerable to outside intervention. The scope of Dr. Winters's operation became clear as he detailed his knowledge of Robert Thompson's research and the reasons for his sudden departure 3 years earlier. Robert had indeed been threatened, but not by a local resident. Dr. Winters' consortium had targeted the Thompson property as a key acquisition, and when Robert had refused to sell, they had used threats against Margaret's safety to force him to leave the area entirely. Henry Blackwood's anger was evident as he confronted Dr. Winters with evidence of similar operations in other states. Communities in Iowa, Missouri, and Kansas had all been targeted by the same methods, with families forced to abandon properties that had been in their families for generations. In each case, the land had been quietly acquired by shell companies and developed into private research facilities that operated without public oversight or accountability. Dr. Morrison added his own piece to the puzzle by revealing that he had been approached months earlier by representatives claiming to be from a pharmaceutical company. They had offered substantial payments for detailed records of animal recoveries and access to water samples from specific locations around Millbrook County. When he had refused their offers, he had begun receiving subtle threats that made him fear for his veterinary practice. The tension in the room reached a breaking point when Dr. Winters made a direct threat against Emma's safety. He claimed that children with her abilities were too valuable to be left in the care of people who didn't understand their potential, and that his research consortium had legal means of removing children from unsuitable environments. His words carried the weight of someone who had used such tactics successfully before. Sarah's response was immediate and fierce. For the first time since Dr. Winters' arrival, she spoke directly to him, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the room. She detailed the psychological abuse she had endured while living with him, the unauthorized experiments he had conducted on Emma without her consent, and the threats he had made when she had discovered the true nature of his research. The revelation that Dr. Winters had been conducting experiments on infant Emma sent shockwaves through the assembled neighbors. Margaret felt a rage building inside her that she had never experienced before, while Tom Henderson's fists clenched as he struggled to maintain control. The idea that anyone would use a helpless child for research purposes struck at the core of everything the community valued about protecting the innocent and vulnerable. Duke's reaction to the confrontation was both surprising and telling. The German shepherd, who had been resting quietly near Emma throughout the discussions, suddenly stood and positioned himself between Dr. Winters and the child. His ears were laid back, his teeth were slightly bared, and a low growl emanated. From deep in his chest, it was clear that Duke sensed the threat that Dr. Winters represented, and his protective instincts were fully activated. Emma's response to the tension was equally remarkable. Instead of crying or showing distress, the baby seemed to draw strength from Duke's presence, babbling softly and reaching her tiny hands toward the dog as if offering comfort. The sight of the child and the animal united in their mutual protection created a powerful symbol that galvanized the entire community. Dr. Winters' final ultimatum revealed the full extent of his desperation and ruthlessness. He announced that his consortium had the resources to make life extremely difficult for everyone in Millbrook County if they continued to interfere with his objectives. He could arrange for property tax reassessments, environmental investigations, and regulatory challenges that would bankrupt most of the families present. However, if they cooperated with his research and allowed him to take Emma for evaluation, he would ensure that the community was left alone. The silence that followed Dr. Winter's threat was broken by Margaret's clear, strong voice as she delivered her response on behalf of the entire community. Her words would echo through Millbrook County for years to come, marking the moment when a group of neighbors became something more, a family united in defense of what they held most dear. Margaret Thompson stepped forward with a dignity that surprised even herself, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had found her purpose in defending those she loved. Her words rang clear and unwavering as she addressed Dr. Winters with the full authority of someone speaking for her entire community. She informed him that Emma was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who valued her as a precious child rather than a research subject, and that no amount of threats or legal maneuvering would change that fundamental truth. The transformation in Margaret was remarkable to witness. The woman who had started the day as a lonely widow grieving for her injured dog had become the fierce protector of a community united in purpose. Her declaration that Millbrook County would stand together against any attempt to exploit their children or steal their land sent a powerful message that resonated through every person present. Tom Henderson immediately stepped forward to support Margaret's position, followed quickly by Dr. Morrison, Henry Blackwood, and every other neighbor. In the room, their unanimous show of solidarity clearly caught Dr. Winters off guard, as he had expected to find a divided community that could be easily manipulated. Instead, he faced a group of people who had discovered that their shared values were stronger than any differences that might have existed between them. Sarah Mitchell's courage in that moment was extraordinary. With Emma safe in her arms and surrounded by protective neighbors, she found the strength to confront her former partner directly. She detailed the emotional manipulation and threats he had used to control her, the unauthorized experiments he had conducted on their infant daughter, and the network of researchers who exploited vulnerable families across the country. Her testimony provided crucial context for understanding the scope of the threat they all faced. Dr. Winters' reaction to this unified resistance revealed the true nature of his character. When charm and threats failed to achieve his objectives, he resorted to increasingly desperate measures. He pulled out his phone and began making calls to associates, demanding immediate assistance and threatening legal action against every person present. His professional facade cracked completely, exposing the ruthless obsession that drove his pursuit of Emma and others like her. It was Henry Blackwood who provided the key insight that would ultimately neutralize Dr. Winters' threat. Drawing on his military experience and research into similar operations, Henry revealed that Dr. Winters' consortium operated in legal gray areas that depended on secrecy and intimidation. When their activities were exposed to public scrutiny, they typically abandoned their operations rather than risk investigations that might reveal the full extent of their unethical practices. Dr. Morrison contributed his own crucial piece to their defense strategy. As a licensed veterinarian with connections throughout the state, he had maintained detailed records of the unusual healing phenomena he had observed in Millbrook County. These records, combined with testimony from local families, could provide compelling evidence of the community's unique characteristics, while also documenting the harassment they had endured from outside interests. The decisive moment came when Mrs. Patterson, at 87, the oldest resident of Millbrook County, stepped forward with information that surprised everyone. She revealed that she had been documenting the anonymous letters and suspicious activities for months, keeping detailed records in a habit formed during her years as a schoolteacher. Her meticulous notes provided a paper trail that directly connected Dr. Winters' consortium to the campaign of psychological warfare that had been waged against their community. Tom Henderson's construction contacts proved invaluable as he began making phone calls to friends in law enforcement and local government. Within minutes, He had arranged for county sheriff deputies to respond to the disturbance at Margaret's property, while also contacting a lawyer who specialized in protecting rural communities from corporate exploitation. The speed with which help was mobilized demonstrated the power of the relationships that had been built over years of mutual support and cooperation. Dr. Winter's desperation became increasingly apparent as his situation deteriorated. When his phone calls failed to produce immediate assistance, he attempted to physically take Emma from Sarah's arms, a move that prompted immediate intervention from every adult in the room. Duke's protective instincts kicked in fully, and the German shepherd positioned himself between Dr. Winters and the baby with a fierce determination that made his intentions unmistakably clear. The arrival of county sheriff deputies marked the beginning of the end for Dr. Winters' operation in Millbrook County. His threats against the community, combined with his attempted assault on Sarah and Emma, provided grounds for immediate intervention. When the deputies searched his vehicle, they discovered surveillance equipment, detailed maps of the area, and communications with his consortium that revealed the systematic nature of their activities. Sarah's decision to file formal charges against Dr. Winters for harassment, threats, and endangering a child created a legal framework that would protect not only Emma, but also other families who might be targeted in the future. Her courage in taking this step, supported by the entire community, sent a clear message that Millbrook County would not tolerate exploitation of any kind. The resolution of the immediate crisis opened the door for healing and understanding that transformed the community in ways no one could have anticipated. Henry Blackwood, who had been viewed with suspicion for so long, was embraced as a valuable member of the community whose knowledge and experience had proven crucial in their defense. His research into the healing properties of their land was no longer seen as threatening, but as a gift that could help them understand and protect their unique heritage. The bond between Emma and Duke became a symbol of the remarkable connections that could flourish when people chose trust over fear. As the days passed, the baby and the German shepherd continued to demonstrate an extraordinary relationship that seemed to accelerate Duke's complete recovery while providing Emma with a constant source of joy and wonder. Their interactions reminded everyone that healing could take many forms, not all of which could be easily explained by conventional science. Margaret's transformation throughout the crisis had been the most remarkable of all. The lonely widow, who had begun the day mourning her injured dog, had discovered that her true family extended far beyond blood relations, to include everyone who shared her commitment to protecting the innocent and vulnerable. Her leadership during the confrontation with Dr. Winters had revealed strengths she never knew she possessed. The community's decision to create a formal support network to protect families like Sarah and Emma marked a new chapter in Millbrook County's history. They established communication systems to share information about suspicious activities, created legal funds to help families defend against exploitation, and developed relationships with outside experts who could provide assistance when needed. Dr. Morrison's veterinary practice became an unofficial center for documenting and understanding the healing phenomena that occurred throughout the area. His careful scientific approach helped legitimize their experiences while protecting the privacy and safety of families who chose to remain in the community. His research attracted the attention of ethical scientists who were interested in studying natural healing properties without exploiting the people who lived near them. The memorial garden that the community created to commemorate their triumph over Dr. Winters' threats became a gathering place where neighbors could celebrate their shared values and mutual support. The garden was planted near the old cistern where Duke had nearly lost his life, transforming a site of trauma into a symbol of renewal and hope. As autumn settled over the Nebraska farmland, Margaret stood on her back porch each morning with renewed purpose and joy. Duke bounded across the yard with the energy of a dog half his age, while Emma's laughter could often be heard from Sarah's cottage as the baby played with her remarkable four-legged friend. The peace that had returned to Millbrook County was deeper and more meaningful than what had existed before, strengthened by the knowledge that they could face any challenge when they stood together. The anonymous letters that had once sowed discord were replaced by genuine communications between neighbors who had learned to value each other's contributions to their shared community. The suspicions and fears that Dr. Winters had tried to exploit had been transformed into trust and mutual support that made their rural paradise stronger than ever before. Dear listeners, we hope that Margaret and Sarah's story has touched your hearts and reminded you of the power of community and compassion. Just as the neighbors of Millbrook County discovered that their greatest strength lay in standing together, we invite you to join our growing family of storytellers and dreamers. If this tale of courage, friendship, and unexpected miracles has moved you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up to help us share these powerful stories with others who need to hear them. We bring you unique stories every day that explore the extraordinary connections between people, animals, and the mysterious forces that shape our lives. Don't miss our upcoming content by hitting the notification bell, and we'd love to hear your thoughts about Margaret, Duke, and Emma's incredible journey in the comments below. Together, we can keep these stories of hope and healing alive for generations to come.